It is time to join Mark Urban. He's here every Monday to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Welcome to the show, Mark.
It's good to be back.
Thanks very much for joining us. Let's talk about what is going on in Syria. There's a ceasefire currently in place in the southern Syrian city of Suwaida after violent clashes between fighters from the Bedouin and Druze communities. That is bad enough, but the real issue is Israel's intervention in this fighting, which has sparked off some concern from the White House, of all people.
I'm not sure that's the real issue, in the sense that it's definitely one of the issues, but the fundamental problem, I think, is the weakness of post-Assad Syria and of the government of Ahmed al-Sharaa, which has now got a lot of support from the White House and others in the hope that they can bring Syria through to be a modern, functioning and safe place. But I think what's emerged really in the last week or two is some very serious communal tensions. We saw a bit of this a couple of months ago with attacks by jihadists and others on the Alawite community in the coastal area of Syria. And these groups have also been active in the Suwaida area. Now, the Israelis did intervene on behalf of the Druze, and that's what's annoyed the Americans, because the Israelis have styled themselves as the protectors of the Druze, which it's a small minority in Syria. There are Druze people in Israel too who are quite loyal to the Israeli state. But I think from the American perspective, the Israelis getting involved in that way, in that kind of muscular way, it was an extreme annoyance at that particular moment. But as I said, I think the bigger issue remains that even if the Israelis refrain, as they appear to be doing now, these communal tensions between the Sunni jihadist groups, for want of a better word, and some of the tribal groups, and the Druze in this southern part of Syria around Suwaida is a serious portent, I think. I mean, several hundred people have been killed. There's been a lot of brutality, a lot of calls for revenge. Some of the other minorities in Syria, for example, the Kurds off to the north, have really taken fear at what's happened there and are very worried. Are very worried about it, because what they're concerned about is the possibility that once the Druze are kind of neutralized in the sense of having armed groups or the ability to protect themselves, the government, with a sort of nod and a wink, might encourage these militant groups to have a go at the Kurds as well. So it's a very difficult situation in which the minorities, some of whom did support the Assad government, are being targeted by militant jihadists, and various outside actors, including the Israelis and the Turks, are involved in various ways.
And can the new administration in Syria contemplate sort of autonomy for the Druze minority in the south of Syria, or is that not on their agenda?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, look, in a way, that's the whole discussion. There can be a degree of, the various terms are used. I think autonomy is regarded as being a bit too far down the road of having a kind of separate existence or their own paramilitary units, for example. I think for the government in the centre, the government of the new president, al-Sharaa, that's too much. Because that would also then encourage the Kurds, who do have, on a very long-standing basis, had their own militia groups, to believe that they could carry on doing the same. So for the government, I think the key here is to try and get all of these different groups to put themselves under the authority of the new government, to accept that they can't have armed groups and to sign up, but accepting also that there needs to be some fora or ways for the community to express themselves and to have a degree of political voice and, dare one say it, autonomy. But formal autonomy is something the government is trying to resist. It's a very tricky situation in which, as I've said, one of the real problems about it is that the Sunnis, who were suppressed in many ways and the target in many ways of the Assad military campaigns over many years at huge cost to their communities, are now in charge. and the taint of having lined up with the Assad government, which of course the Alawites, that was Assad's own group in the coast, the Druze, the Kurds, the Christians, various other groups, are all seen by some of the more militant Sunni elements within the government to have been part of the Assad power structure and therefore partly responsible for their suffering during those years of civil war. So it's a very, very difficult situation, frankly.
Let's talk about Israel's role there, because there are Druze obviously living in Israel as well. And on the surface, of course, Israel can say it's perfectly justified to intervene to protect the Druze. But there will also be, I assume, at the back of Netanyahu's mind, a huge opportunity here to establish sort of Israeli presence in that area as a strategic toehold, frankly, as a part of his strategy to protect Israel, regardless of whether you think that is right or wrong. That will be his thinking, won't it?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, if you want to see a kind of Machiavellian element to what's going on in terms of Israeli policy, I think it's more to do with the idea that they want to keep Syria as a kind of weak buffer state. And I think there are some people in the Israeli government who think that way. There are others, though, who I think are more on message with what President Trump wants to achieve, which is a peace deal. And if you believe that's right, and there definitely are some in the Israeli power structure or government or parliament who want that, then they're going to have to give up, for example, some of the little tracts of land they've taken. I think if we go back to this idea that, Israel wants a sort of weak Syria, the other key player here is Turkey. Now, Turkey, for years, kept more than 10,000 troops in Syria, was very active in the northern part of Syria, including mounting military attacks against Kurdish groups there, and has been a big player and hopes, in a way, to reap the reward of having a very close relationship with the president's party. They were, in many ways, his principal foreign backer during the years where he was fighting the Assad government. And I think the other element in this is the degree to which there is now something of a power struggle between Turkey and Israel in the country, and the degree to which different militias and different groups could become proxies in that contest. I think probably the lesson we've learned in the last week or two is that if we had a sort of hope, as Trump did, that Syria might be the next country to sign a peace deal with Israel, and there was talk, it was being briefed out by the White House that they could meet on the margins of the General Assembly at the UN in New York in September. That is, Netanyahu and Sharar, the Syrian president, could meet there in the hope of sort of tying up a peace deal, a normalization. Then I think we can understand that the hopes of that are looking a lot less likely today than they were a couple of weeks ago. And I think that some of those quotes we've seen over the weekend from attributed to people in the White House of saying, Netanyahu's a madman, all that kind of stuff, is part of their frustration that prospect now seems to be getting more and more remote.
Let's talk about what's happening as well in Gaza. There's a report, the Hamas-run health ministry, saying 67 people were killed by the Israeli military while waiting for UN aid lorries. This is obviously a horrific situation in Gaza, and there seems to be no end in sight.
Well, this is a consequence of the disastrous policy that Netanyahu has pursued, in the sense of not having a clear idea about the end state that he wants to achieve there. Now, the Israelis have, of course, said that central to their operations there is the desire to free their hostages. Now, it's thought that Hamas and its affiliated groups still have around 20 living Israeli hostages there. And that, in theory, is the reason for everything that's going on. However, the Israeli government also has objectives to do with overthrowing Hamas from its position of power in the Gaza Strip, which are much harder to quantify and much harder to get a sense of when will we see an actual end state to that. I mean, the military, since May of 2024, has been saying to the Israeli government, look, basically we're done in terms of destroying Hamas as a large-scale military organization. And so everything really is about these other objectives, which is the hostages and this idea that they can somehow remove them from power while recognizing that they will probably still continue as a political force. And conversely, from the Hamas perspective, that is the key. I think they've offered to release the remaining hostages in return for a long-term peace agreement. But what they don't want to do is to embrace their own removal from power. That's a step too far. Hamas has always been about trying to ensure its own survival as the rulers of Gaza. And therefore, that is, in a sense, the kind of irreducible fact that lies behind this. Now, this situation with the aid distribution centers derives from a decision that the Israelis took back in May to go in and increase their military footprint in Gaza. Now, I think they would say this was all about putting pressure to get the hostages released, but also putting pressure on the Palestinian community to basically drop Hamas and accept different rulers. But it was always clear that it was going to involve them. Firstly, it was going to be disastrous for the civilian population of Gaza. There'd be far more confrontations between the Israeli military, a far higher loss of non-combatant civilians, and that in taking responsibility essentially for large parts of the enclave, they would have to step up and find another solution to things like aid distribution. And the solution that was come up with has clearly been another disaster in the sense that they've got 4 aid centers run by this group called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is an American charity. And they replaced hundreds of smaller local aid distribution centers that the United Nations agencies had in Gaza. The United Nations has not wanted to go along with the Israeli plans and reoccupation and all the rest of it. And once again, civilians are caught in the middle of that impasse. With disastrous results, certainly several hundred people killed since this new system has come into effect. Now, obviously, Gaza Health Ministry and officials aligned with Hamas seek to put the whole blame for that on the Israeli military. The Israeli military is clearly responsible for many of these deaths. But there is, I think, there as well a rather complicated picture in terms of the guards who are effectively American mercenaries employed by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation are clearly also responsible for some of the deaths. And some of the tribal groups, Gazans, Palestinians who've been trying to steal aid, and Hamas itself have also been involved in clashes around the aid distribution points. So the exact question of who is responsible for how many of these deaths is not easy to decipher, but clearly it's the Israelis, by taking responsibility for this aid distribution system and by being the occupying power, who have an overall responsibility for what's going on there.
I see. It is an extremely complicated and difficult situation. Mark Urban, thank you so much for joining us and talking us through what is happening with the Druze minority in Syria and the ongoing tragedy of Gaza and the civilians being killed at aid point.